Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started. Hi, my name is Ben, and I am the Chief Planning Officer at the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, New Jersey. Really glad to be here with all of you. I'm new to the Jewish Federation team. I started at Greater Metro West back in August, so it's been a few months, been a great first few months for me, meeting great colleagues like Emily, who's here with us, who I know liaises with all of you and helps coordinate our efforts across the space of Jewish early childhood education in Metro West. And meeting lots of great people out in the community. So some of you I think I've gotten to meet already, and those I haven't, I'm really glad to meet you here, and hopefully sometime soon we'll get to meet in a more less public, but maybe a little more personal setting. In the meantime, it's been a really serendipitous time to start in my role at Federation, because it's been right at this exciting moment in the Greater Metro West community where we are looking together at this incredible 2020 community study. Really excited to have released the study last month, back in November. The purpose of the 2020 community study is to provide the Greater Metro West Jewish community with reliable information to help all of us, those of us working at the Federation and all of you working out in the Jewish community, to better fulfill our mission to care for people in need and build a vibrant Jewish community. We haven't collected this sort of data in Greater Metro West for over 20 years. So it's really amazing that the Federation leadership already a couple of years ago invested in a state-of-the-art research study to learn about ourselves. We engaged the Maurice and Marilyn Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, which is a renowned multidisciplinary research institute dedicated to the study of American Jewry and religious and cultural identity. The community study, hopefully you've already gotten a chance to take a look at it, but if you haven't, it's all available on the Federation website, and you can read all of the reports there. This afternoon, we're really pleased to have Janet Aaronson, the lead researcher of our community study, with us. And in a few moments, she's going to share details about the study, how she went about it with her team, some of the methodology, and then share some key findings with you from the community study reports. Some of them are broad key findings just about the larger Greater Metro West Jewish community, and a number of key findings that Janet selected specifically related to early childhood education and Jewish education. After Janet's presentation, we'll have some chance for questions. So you can submit questions in the chat. Feel free to just put questions as Janet's speaking, and I'll be keeping track so that I can moderate the questions later. And then also, if you want to wait, you can wait till Janet starts speaking. You can put questions in the chat later then too. So, so that's what the plan is for this afternoon. So a little bit more of a formal introduction. Janet Krasner Aaronson is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis, and she has directed and contributed to local Jewish community studies in over a dozen Jewish communities. Recently published a study for the Chicago Jewish community, and the most recent one is for Greater Metro West, New Jersey. And it's especially gratifying for Janet to be learning about her home community, because she grew up here in Metro West. She grew up in Union County and is a proud graduate of what was once called the Solomon Schechter Day School of Essex in Union when she was a student there, and now we know as Golda Ak Academy. So it's really wonderful to welcome Janet back home to share her learning from her study of the Greater Metro West Jewish community. And I'm going to turn it over to Janet.
Thanks, Ben, and nice to see everybody here. Happy to have the chance to talk to you about this exciting study. I'm going to go through, as Ben said, I'm going to give you some highlights of the study, some thoughts about how to understand it and read it, and then we'll dig into some data that's specific to issues related to early childhood. I'm not going to be looking at the chat. Again, you can put in questions if they occur to you as we go along, and then we'll have a chance to answer as many as we can at the end of the data of the slideshow. I want to start out by just framing as how we think about these studies. Was the purpose. Ben mentioned that there are all the reports for the study posted on the Federation website. I encourage you to take a look. There is one report that's specifically about children and Jewish education, and of course you'll want to read that one. But I'd encourage you to look at all of them because they're all interrelated. The first one is an overview report. There's one called an overview report. That is a good place to start because that gives the demographics of the entire community and some of the basic information that's used throughout to kind of understand the community as a whole. I'm going to be presenting some highlights of that here so that you'll have some framing of the whole study. As you read the reports, I want to point out a few things to keep in mind, and this would be particularly important for this conversation today. The study is based on a large sample. I'll go talk about the methodology a little bit, but of course, it's a survey. It is not we didn't go out to every parent of preschoolers and ask them questions. So we take a survey, a random sample of people, and we extrapolate the results to what we might have expected to find if every single person in the community answered that question. Obviously, it's not precise. It's similar to what's done with election polls that a lot of people are familiar with, that we have an estimate and a margin of error. So that's true in these surveys as well. So the story here is not the precise data points. We can assume that most of the numbers, imagine there's a plus or minus 5 around each one. That's just a ballpark. But what's really interesting is to look at differences. Where are there important differences between different groups and how does their behavior compare? In terms of the survey itself, our survey included responses from almost 3,300 Jewish households, and I'll talk in a moment about what Jewish households are. That it was a 33% response rate, which in this day and age of survey research, it is very high. So we're very pleased about that and really confident that the results represent the community as a whole. One thing to keep in mind is the timing of the study. It was conducted between October and December 2020, finished just about a year ago. And we all know that the world was a crazy place last fall, winter. It still is a crazy place. So not only because of COVID, but because of the political situation, the election. On the one hand, it was a hard time to do a survey. On the other hand, it was a particularly important time to really understand people's experiences at that time. So there were a lot of questions where that we modified to reflect what was going on in the moment. And I'll talk about those where they come up, but some of them do relate to things like participation in Jewish education. So when we get to those numbers, I'll talk about how we dealt with that. So now key findings about the community as a whole. So the place where we start is what is the size of the greater Metro West Jewish community? And as you can see here, there are a lot of numbers. It's not an easy question. There's not a single answer to that question. So there are over 122,000 Jewish individuals in greater Metro West, and they live in almost 57,000 Jewish households. I'll talk in a moment how we define those. But a Jewish household is one in which there is at least one Jewish adult. Now, of course, not everybody in a Jewish household is Jewish. So when we think about all of the people in Jewish households, that number is 155,000. So that's often communities think about that as the broadest definition of what is the greater Metro West Jewish community. In terms of defining the Jewish, we have Jewish adults and non-Jewish adults, Jewish children and non-Jewish children. Jewish adults are those adults ages 18 and older who consider themselves Jewish, either where they say Judaism is their religion, or they consider themselves Jewish ethnically or culturally. In addition, they also need to tell us that they've had at least one Jewish parent, or were raised Jewish, or converted to Judaism. So that's the definition. In addition, we include in this group people who say that they are Jewish and another religion. The Pew study, which many of you may be familiar with, does not include those folks as Jewish, but we do because they still consider themselves to be Jewish, at least in some way. With children, it's a little bit simpler. We just say to the parents, do you consider this child to be Jewish? Whether it's by religion, culturally, we don't really care. So those are the people, those are the more than 25,000 children. The vast majority are considered Jewish by their parents. Let's look at a picture of what are the boundaries of Greater Metro West New Jersey. And you know that this is a very large community. Geographically, it's different than most Jewish communities in the United States. There isn't one, downtown or Jewish core. There are a lot of different places where Jews live. And we have here the whole community, the whole area is divided into 4 regions. Union County by itself, Essex County by itself, most of Morris County, and the remainder, Sussex, a little bit of Morris, a little bit of Somerset, are combined together to make one big area. The reason why they're combined is because there are just not that many Jewish households in those areas. It's the least dense. And so in order to have enough people to sort of say anything about that group, we had to combine them. You can see from this map the difference in the density. Each red dot represents about 25 households in that zip code, kind of randomly placed. So you can see the higher concentration of Jewish households here in Essex and somewhat in Union, and that's sort of reflected in this map. The largest share of Jewish households is in Essex County, that's 38%. The next largest share, a quarter of households, are in East Morris. And then about the same share are in Union and in the Western Greater Metro West area. I'll talk a little bit later about the distribution of children. I'll go in more detail. A few more pieces of information about households and families. About 80% of Jewish adults are either married or have a partner that they live with. And of those, 33% are married. Are intermarried. They're married to a non-Jewish person. It's lower than the average for all the whole U.S. Jewish community. 30% of households include a minor child. That's someone under age 18. About equal numbers of children are being raised by intermarried and in-married parents. And then a small group, 8%, are being raised by single parents. In terms of household finances, and this was a particularly important area during COVID. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but just so you have the basic information. We asked people both their income and to describe their standard of living. Income is not a fully reliable measure of how people are doing financially. It depends upon a lot of other household side, debts, other sources of income, savings, and so forth. So we really focus on the standard of living, how they describe their circumstances. And 2% of households said they cannot make ends meet. 15% say they're just managing to make ends meet. So this group together, 17%, are the group that we refer to throughout the report as financially struggling. We have a lot of other information about financial measures and measures of struggling, but I will note that consistent with a lot of other research done on this topic, the households that were financially struggling were hardest hit by the pandemic. So those who are struggling more also really experience more financial difficulties, as well as other difficulties needing more social services and more health needs. Now I'm going to move on to talk about Jewish engagement. And this is also obviously an important theme of the study. And I want to spend some time on it because we have a model of Jewish engagement that is new to most people. And I want to take a few moments to explain what that is. You, I'm sure, are familiar with Jewish denominations. which is the most common way we measure Jewish engagement. And you can see this column here. This shows the percent of Metro West Jewish adults who are identified with each denomination. And in comparison, this is from the Pew study from 2020. This shows the percent of all US Jews. You can see that Metro West has a slightly smaller share of Orthodox. Here's a place where even though these numbers might look that different, they might not actually be that different. So this is not, it's not a huge difference. They're slightly more conservative, slightly less reform, but the patterns are basically similar as we found across the Jewish community. What I really want to point out is this 38% of people who say they have no Jewish denomination. They chose from a set of responses. About half of them said that they were secular or culturally Jewish. Half of them said that they were just Jewish. So we treat those the same. This is a growing group in the United States. Across all Jews, it's 32%. So this is about the same. And one of the questions here is, what does it mean to have no denomination? So I'm going to be talking more about that in a moment. In order to answer that question, we've developed a model of understanding Jewish engagement that we call the Index of Jewish Engagement. And it's a statistically derived model where we look at a set of 18 Jewish behaviors. And unlike denomination, which kind of focuses on religious and ritual behavior, we also look at cultural behavior, individual behavior, the things you do at home, like reading Jewish books or watching Jewish TV shows or following news about Israel, communal behavior, belonging to an organization, volunteering, donating, things like that. And we look at these together and we try to describe what are the patterns we see, what are the different groupings of what kinds of behaviors people do. The purpose of this model is not to create a hierarchy of good or bad engagement, high and low engagement. It's really just to describe the patterns that we see, to give some language about what does Jewish engagement look like in Greater Metro West in 2021. And this is a model, although we use this method for all of the communities we study, this model is specific to Greater Metro West based on the patterns that we found here. Also, just to emphasize, it's not like denomination. We didn't ask a survey question that says, which one of these are you? This is patterns that we saw after the fact, and we tried to describe them. So these are the 5 groups that we identified in Greater Metro West. I'm going to sort of describe them briefly based on the size of the groups. So the 16% we call minimally involved. They actually do very little in Jewish life. About the same share, 14% are immersed. They do everything. They do ritual behavior, communal behavior, and individual behavior. In between, there are 3 other groups. 15% who we call involved are similar to immersed, but they do a little bit less. They don't do everything. They do many of those things, but they do all different types of things. Then we have these 2, the largest groups, one we call familial and one we call personal. So a quarter, they're each about a quarter of Jewish adults. The familial group, the main things that they do are what we call the home-based holidays. Hanukkah just passed, and Passover are their primary ones. So they're not really involved with Jewish institutions or synagogues that much, but they are involved with Jewish life at home and with their families. And this other group about the same size is the personal group. They're doing the individual Jewish activities, not so much the ritual activities, but let's say the cultural activities. They may be participating in programs. Some of them may be doing them online, but they're not joining organizations. They're not joining synagogues, and they're not really doing ritual Jewish life. So I won't go through all of this, but this lists out the behaviors that we discussed, that we measured, and just shows how many people in each group did each one of those behaviors. So how does this differ from denomination? I mean, that's the important question. And I think if you look across, you can see that this group that I said, the 38% who had no denomination, well, it's easy to say, well, they just don't do anything Jewish. But it turns out that of that group, only a quarter of them are in the minimally involved group. Everybody else does some Jewish activities, and there's a range of the ways that they behave. You can also see, particularly among the conservative and reform Jews, where we know that people call themselves conservative and reform, but they actually behave in a lot of different ways. You could see that there are people in those groups in every one of these engagement groups. In the Orthodox group, although the vast majority are immersed, 84%, quite a few are also in the personal group. So just to kind of bring the point home about what this translates to, one thing we look about it is how do people in the different groups think about their Jewish lives? And we have a lot of questions to get at this, but this is one that kind of sort of captures the importance of Judaism to many people. They ask, to what extent is being Jewish part of your daily life? And you can see that in that immersed group, 2/3 of them say it is very much part of their daily life. The personal and the involved group, although their behaviors are very different, they actually agree with each other, and they answer this question very similarly about how much Judaism is part of their daily life. And then the two other groups, minimally involved and familial, also very similar, that a third or more of them say Judaism is not at all part of their daily life. So the goal of this model is really just to help you think about Jewish engagement in a different way, and think more, perhaps broadly, more expansively, about what Jewish engagement means and what would it look like to try to engage with these people and people in different groups. What does it look like to enhance Jewish engagement for someone in the familial group compared to, let's say, someone in the involved group? So those are the questions that I want you to think about. The last thing on Jewish engagement, because this is just so basic to Jewish engagement, we found that 29% of households are members of a synagogue. That is just about the same as the national average. It's over here where we look at people who are members of synagogues. And this shows the distribution of what of those households, what denomination they're members of. And remember that synagogue denomination is different than the denomination, how you describe yourself. Okay, that's all the background in the study, and I want to spend the rest of the time talking about children and get into the part that's most important to this group. So first I want to talk about children. This is the number of children age 17 and younger in all of Greater Metro West Jewish households. And I mentioned that we define them as Jewish. We say, how do your parents consider the children? 86% of children, their parents just say that they're Jewish. 86% of the children are Jewish. 2/3, 65% are just Jewish, no other religion. 21% Jewish and another religion. 9% have no religion. 5% have another religion. So the vast majority are Jewish alone or Jewish and another religion. When we talk about participation in Jewish education, we're going to be talking about Jewish children only, these first two groups, because children who are not considered Jewish almost never are in Jewish education. Sometimes a handful are. Now let's look at the age breakdown. So of all children, children sort of skew a little bit older in Greater Metro West. It's not full of young children. It may be because people are moving in when their children are already born, so we're perhaps school age. I think that's how I would understand this. So 43%, now of course these age ranges are also not the same size, but 43% of Jewish children are teenagers, 38% are between 6 and 12 school age, and 18% are 0 to 5. And that's just about the same as of all children. And this is just the breakdown of the children who are not Jewish. I mentioned this earlier, but just coming back to thinking about those Jewish children, about half of them, almost half, are being raised by intermarried parents, the same number being raised by unmarried parents, and a small share, 8%, are being raised by single parents. Now, of all of the children, I want to look at what are the parents' decisions about raising their children. Among unmarried parents, almost all of them consider their children Jewish, nothing else. Among intermarried parents, almost half of their children are Jewish. About a third are Jewish and another religion. And the rest are either just another religion or no religion. And single parents are somewhere in between. I want to look at these children by what's the regional distribution of the 4 regions that I mentioned. 38% of Jewish children are in Essex. Next largest share, 29%, are in East Morris. And about the same share are in Union and in Western Greater Metro West. And similarly, we can look at household composition by region, and you could just see that about a third of the households in Essex have minor children. About a quarter of households in Union and Western Greater Metro West have minor children, and 30% of East Morris households have minor children. Okay, and now I'm going to turn to Jewish early childhood programs. I'm going to talk about this, but I will preface this by saying we do not have as much detail on this as I know that you all want. One of the reasons is we're limited in our analysis by the number of survey respondents we have. And of those 3,000 survey respondents, we have to narrow in on those with preschool age children. Although we can say a fair amount of information about all preschool age children, we can't break it down as much as we want among, let's say, the regions or the details, but I'm going to provide the information that we do have, and then we could talk about what this means. So 30% of Jewish children, Jewish preschool age children, were enrolled in Jewish preschool in 20 to 21 in the last school year. And this just shows that of other grades, what other kinds of Jewish education. I meant to pull out the numbers, and sorry, I can send them out to you later. I forgot. This number is actually pretty high. The share who are enrolled in Jewish preschool is higher than some other communities that we've looked at. And I can't tell you how much of that was because of COVID, if the numbers increased during COVID, but I have seen communities with this number in the single digits of Jewish preschool enrollment. Generally, we don't compare one community to another because the circumstances of the communities are so different and the context, but I will notice that in general, I think this is relatively high. We don't have any national numbers. Pew did not ask these kinds of questions, so we can't do national comparisons. There was a question that I was asked before this presentation about, do we know how this number was affected by COVID? Do we think it was up or down? And what I'll tell you is that the best way to know how did preschool enrollment change from the year before COVID to last year to this year is actually to look at your administrative data and to put together the number of children in preschool. In fact, one of the ways we measure that this number was correct is that if people from Federation reached out to all of the preschools and gathered that data for 20 to 21 so that we could actually check our survey results and make sure that they matched reality. And that's a really advisable practice to track that number over time. The number of children will not change that much over time. It's not going to change too much from year to year. But if you can gather the enrollment data, you could see if the percentage changes over time. So that's what I'd recommend. There's some other programs that we asked about in terms of and information. We asked if it's related to preschoolers. I mentioned 30% attend a Jewish preschool. Another 30% of children were in either a home-based early childhood program or an early childhood program that was not Jewish. So that left about 40% of children who were not in any preschool. About 28% of families with children under age 13 received books from PJ Library. And another thing that's often relevant for families with young children is we have some information about grandparents. You can look for more in the report, but about 40% of families with children have local grandparents and 41% have grandparents who live not locally. And we talk about how those parents help out with whether it's childcare, financial support, and so on. And obviously some families have grandparents both local and out of the area. And the last piece of information that I think is the most useful for the group is questions about for families who have a child in Jewish preschool, child in preschool, what are the reasons that you chose that preschool? So if these were the responses, it was just like, were any of these the reasons? These were the responses among people in any childhood programs, and this is specific to Jewish programs. So you can see the Jewish reasons, Jewish values, and Jewish content were only asked about Jewish run programs, of course. And you can see this is arranged roughly in order of this group. So you can see that the top reason is schedule and convenient location, and those were the top reasons for all preschools and Jewish preschools as well. Some people are wondering if cost is a big factor, but that actually was not a reason. Now, it's important to interpret this appropriately. So this is of people who chose a Jewish preschool. So this is saying, this is really to say that the cost was not the reason that you chose this preschool over another preschool. It doesn't answer the question of whether people whose children were not in preschool at all, if cost was a reason that they did not enroll. So just want to make sure that you have that interpretation carefully. And that's, I think that this slide is the most valuable information for the people on this call, and we can spend some more time talking about this or any other data that I showed you today.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks so much for all of that data and for your presentation. Thanks to a couple of you who've already put some questions in the chat. Please do keep those questions coming. As you're starting to write questions, just a word about the types of questions we can answer. So please do ask Janet any questions about anything she presented today. The methodology of the study, any of the slides she shared, any of the data points she brought forward, or even if you've had an opportunity to read the reports yourself, if you have specific things that Janet didn't present today, but that you can say, oh yes, in the Children and Jewish Education report on this page, there's this data point. Feel free to point that out to Janet. She'll be happy to answer questions about that. And as good as Janet is at answering questions and telling us all about this study that she and her team did, as you can see, it's a massive data set, and we have not expected Janet to put it all to memory. So please don't ask questions that ask her to draw some detail from the data set off the top of her head that Janet won't be able to do. So again, to reiterate, any questions about anything Janet presented or anything from the report. So there are questions here already about this last slide about selecting preschools. Mary Lou writes, any ideas why parents are choosing non-Jewish early childhood over Jewish early childhood programs?
I'm going to look at the data that's on here, and I would say the fact that for both of these, schedule and convenient location was top. It's telling me that that's the primary driver. And I know that I'm going to imagine that with the distribution of, of the Jewish households in this huge geographic area, and I don't know exactly where the preschools are, but the question would always be if the Jewish preschool is a longer drive, is not so available, then there would have to be a really positive reason to choose that. I think if they're equal, if equally convenient, if the schedule works, then people are actually choosing between them. And then 41% of the people in Jewish preschools are saying that the Jewish values and Jewish content are important to them. But even those people are saying that the schedule and location have to work for them before they move on to the Jewish content.
Thanks, Janet. That what you just point out actually relates to a question we got in advance of this presentation that was, asking specifically about this chart, and wondering how should this inform how early child centers focus their priorities on the list, the Jewish values and content or curriculum, given that parents don't rate them as importantly.
Mm-hmm. I am sure that you all know this area much better than I do, but my understanding is that choices about Jewish preschool are Jewish, the Jewish content of it is really a piece, but it's not the primary piece. The schedule, the location, the environment, the school quality are tops. And that's why I certainly know in my area, there are a lot of non-Jewish children attending Jewish preschools as well, because they recognize the quality, the convenience, and location. So I think that there's a segment of the population for whom having it be a Jewish preschool is a priority, but that does not appear to be the majority of people. Mm-hmm. And I think the majority is they're choosing for other reasons, and the fact that it's Jewish is important, but less so. So I think it's your competition, such as it is, it's not one Jewish preschool versus another. It's the universe of preschools, and asking parents to, especially if it's going a little farther, going a little out of their way, if it's more expensive, perhaps, it has to be, the quality has to be, and convenience have to be, on par with any of their other choices. And then the Jewish content is, I don't want to say a bonus, because that sounds trivializes, but from a practical standpoint, that seems to take take lower priority for most parents.
Right.
Not all.
Thanks.
Not all.
There's a question here about the impact of universal pre-K. On this chart, I'll just point out cost is almost at the bottom of the priority list here. Right.
So again, I'm not that familiar with this issue. I think yes, I think it will, even if cost is not an issue, it may be more convenient. There may be a lot of other reasons, because it's going to be, if it's really offered in every school district and it's in your town and it's the school that your older children go to, there will be a lot of practical reasons why universal pre-K will be appealing.
Right.
And on the other hand, it may not offer the hours. It may not be childcare. It may not offer that hours that a preschool can offer. So, but I think that it's going to be an issue of the schedule and location. Now, if it turns out that these public programs are not of the same quality as a private program, then of course that's going to be people's consideration as well. And
right.
People have to weigh all of that.
Right. Thanks, Janet. Another question came in about how this chart actually breaks down in terms of early childhood education programs that are connected to Jewish day schools. Are those in the Jewish-run programs or the all early childhood program column?
They're in the Jewish-run programs. Yeah. So yes, anything that's Jewish sponsored is counted as a Jewish run.
And then the question would be, is there any, I'm going to ask you a question knowing that it's a plausible that we won't be able to answer it, but would be able to break it out for early childhood programs that are in day schools and those that are in synagogues or other settings?
That I know we won't, because we didn't even ask that. And the things we asked about are the Jewish run, the home-based, and the non-Jewish. And I don't know that, whether we could break those out would be a question of numbers that I don't have at my fingertips, but we didn't ask who was the sponsor of the Jewish program.
Got it. Thank you. Any other questions about anything Janet presented? Please put them in the chat. Or any other questions about any of the data you've had a chance to read through on your own? So Janet, one of the things we've talked about in some of the other meetings we've been in is ways that people could use this data and what sort of questions they could be asking themselves in their school and in their synagogue communities as they're thinking about what they might learn and might do with it.
Well, I think we've talked about for preschool what for early childhood things, specifically some of the implications of this slide. But I will take a few minutes thinking more generally about the study, and I think particularly about the issue of Jewish engagement. And I think it's particularly relevant for the early childhood space. There's clear data that from many other researchers that Jewish early childhood is an entry point for many families into Jewish education, Jewish life, particularly intermarried families, but any sort of less engaged Jewish families. So on the one hand, yes, I said that the Jewish values and Jewish content are not necessarily the primary drivers of choosing Jewish preschool, but once families have made that choice, it's such an opportunity to reach out to them. And I encourage you to think about that model of Jewish engagement and the different ways of engaging in Jewish life. And I think for the early childhood world, one of the most important groups to think about is what we call the Familial Group. And it's so helpful to think about this time of year right after Hanukkah. And these are families, the families that I'm sure you're all familiar with, who their primary Jewish engagement is Hanukkah and Passover. And having their children in Jewish early childhood is a golden opportunity to enrich those experiences for them. And it may be, I think that sometimes the Jewish community doesn't embrace those families so well, and don't really value those Jewish experiences. But what we see is that is a quarter of Jewish households in Greater Metro West for whom that is their primary Jewish experience. And you are the entry point. You are the primary. The Jewish preschool may be the primary Jewish connection for many families. And it's both it's a golden opportunity and a responsibility. But I think thinking about investing in those home-based activities rather than saying, okay, in order to be more connected with Jewish life, you need to join a synagogue, you need to do more. I encourage you to think about how do you enhance and deepen the experiences that people are already participating in. And who knows what that'll lead to. It may lead them to the next thing. It may lead them to further connection, further Jewish education. But I think that that's the most important insight, I think, from this study that we've tried to present.
Thanks, Janet. I really appreciate your point about the different ways that members of the Greater Metro West Jewish community are participating in Jewish activities, and how we have the opportunity to strengthen our Jewish community by thinking about how we can help them do that. And thanks to everybody for being here today. This is really the beginning of a conversation for all of us to think about what the data means and what we might do in response to the data to strengthen our community. So we invite you and hope that you'll do that in all of the early childhood programs that you are leading. At Federation, we're doing the same. Our lay leaders and professionals are working in partnership to bring together trends from across the community study reports and to identify priority areas for attention and exploration based on the data. We'll be sharing our work as it proceeds in the weeks and months ahead. And in the meantime, as you have those conversations, as they relate to your communities and your schools, please, if additional questions about the data arise, or you want to dig into some aspect of the study, please contact me or contact Emily. We'll be glad to be thought partners with you and think through what is it that the data already says, what other follow-up questions might we be able to look into, so that we can all learn from this together and really help strengthen the work that we do. It's very encouraging to hear Janet say that the portion of eligible Jewish children who come to our Jewish early childhood programs is larger than we have in other communities. And it's a great place for us to leverage the amazing work that you're doing to strengthen our Jewish community. So really, truly, we hope to be in continued partnership with you. I want to thank everybody again for joining us and wish you a good rest of your day. Thanks so much.